When the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt first rolled onto airfields in the early 1940s, few people were impressed. In fact, many laughed. Compared to the sleek Spitfires of Britain or the nimble Messerschmitts of Germany, the P-47 looked like a clumsy giant. It was huge, bulky, and carried the kind of weight that made pilots question if it could even perform as a true fighter. Some sarcastically called it a flying bathtub. Others said it was more suited to hauling cargo than fighting wars. German pilots were the first to mock it openly. They had faced fast, agile opponents before, but when they saw the massive frame of the Thunderbolt, they dismissed it as an easy kill. To them it was slow, oversized, and no match for their nimble Focke-Wulf 190s or Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Even among Allied ranks, there was doubt. Many American and British pilots who transitioned to the P-47 were shocked by how heavy it felt in the air. It climbed slowly, struggled to turn tightly, and didn't have the grace of other fighters. For men who had dreamed of dogfighting glory, the Thunderbolt felt like a letdown. This skepticism wasn't without reason. Early test flights revealed flaws. Its massive Pratt & Whitney engine generated immense power, but that power was trapped inside a frame that felt too heavy to maneuver effectively. In dogfights, where speed and agility often decided life or death, the P-47 looked like it stood no chance. The Mustang could chase enemies across the sky. The Spitfire could outturn nearly anything it faced. But the Thunderbolt? It lumbered. It groaned. And it looked like the wrong tool for the job. Whispers spread among the pilots. Why are we being given this? Mechanics joked about needing extra time just to push the massive fighter onto the runway. Even the German propaganda machine seized the moment, portraying the new American fighter as proof of Allied desperation. Big, clumsy machines trying to compete with German engineering excellence. At that moment in history, almost no one believed the P-47 would become a threat. To its critics, it was a mistake in design, a symbol of wasted effort and a target waiting to be shot down. What they didn't know was that behind that bulky frame, the P-47 hid qualities that would soon shock the world. The P-47 Thunderbolt entered service in 1942, but its early days were far from glorious. For many pilots, climbing into the cockpit of this enormous machine felt less like stepping into a fighter plane and more like squeezing into a heavy bomber disguised as a single-seater. The Thunderbolt's sheer size was unmatched among Allied fighters of the time. Standing next to a Spitfire or a Mustang, it looked almost comical, and that comparison carried over into its performance. From the very first missions, the Thunderbolt showed serious weaknesses. The most glaring problem was its climb rate. In aerial combat, the ability to gain altitude quickly often meant survival. German fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 could rocket upwards with ease, choosing when and where to strike. The P-47, on the other hand, struggled to get off the ground, groaning its way skyward like a reluctant heavyweight boxer entering the ring. Pilots quickly realized that against a skilled German opponent, the Thunderbolt was at risk before the fight even began. Dogfighting also posed major issues. The aircraft's weight and bulk made tight turns nearly impossible. Against nimble German fighters, the P-47 often felt like it was dancing out of rhythm, always a half-step behind. Pilots who had once flown Spitfires or P-40s felt handicapped in the Thunderbolt, forced into maneuvers the plane simply wasn't built to execute. Then, there were the mechanical challenges. The P-47's Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, while immensely powerful on paper, was a maintenance nightmare in the early days. Overheating was a constant issue. On long missions, reliability was questionable, and many pilots found themselves stranded by mechanical failures before even engaging the enemy. The turbo supercharger, designed to give the P-47 an edge at high altitude, was complex and prone to problems. Maintaining the aircraft became an exhausting task for ground crews, who spent long hours trying to keep the Jug ready for combat. The aircraft's heavy weight also meant short range. This was a crippling limitation in the early European air war. American bombers flying deep into Germany needed escorts, but the Thunderbolt simply couldn't keep up. It could protect bombers for part of the journey, but at a certain point, P-47s had to turn back, leaving vulnerable formations to fend for themselves against swarms of German fighters. This failure to escort bombers all the way to their targets drew sharp criticism from commanders and pilots alike. German propaganda capitalized on these shortcomings. Luftwaffe pilots were told to laugh at the Thunderbolt, and many genuinely did. Stories spread of lumbering jugs that couldn't climb out of danger or turn fast enough to survive. To German aces, shooting down a P-47 was often considered easier than engaging a Mustang or a Spitfire. Even among the Americans, confidence was low. New pilots transitioning into the P-47 often complained. They had joined the Air Corps dreaming of fast, elegant dogfighters, only to be handed a machine that felt awkward and clumsy. To them it seemed like a cruel joke, yet hidden beneath these early failures was potential. Though mocked for its size, that bulk carried something few realized at first: its resilience. Thunderbolts often returned from missions riddled with bullet holes that would have shredded other fighters. Engines coughed back to life after hits that should have been fatal. Wings and fuselages held together against punishment that would have splintered lighter planes. While it didn't climb or turn well, it could dive with unmatched ferocity, reaching speeds that stunned even seasoned pilots. But at this stage of the war, those hidden strengths were overshadowed by visible weaknesses. In 1942 and early 1943, the P-47's reputation was defined by frustration, doubt, and derision. Many wondered if it was a mistake, an oversized fighter doomed to fail in the skies over Europe. The Thunderbolt had not yet found its purpose, and until it did, it remained the laughingstock of the skies. What nobody expected was that these very weaknesses would soon force pilots to develop new tactics that would unlock the true power of the P-47 and transform it into one of the most feared war machines of World War II. By the middle of 1943, the P-47 Thunderbolt's reputation was bruised. Pilots grumbled, mechanics cursed its complexity, and commanders questioned its future. To many, it was still an overweight fighter that couldn't climb or turn well enough to challenge the Luftwaffe. But in war, survival has a way of rewriting reputations. And for the Thunderbolt, its survival was built into its very bones. The first clue came from pilots who returned from missions in aircraft that looked like they had been through hell. Wings riddled with cannon holes, fuselages torn by flak, engines leaking oil. Yet somehow the Jug, as it came to be affectionately nicknamed, limped home. Other aircraft, lighter and more graceful, might have been lost forever to the battlefield. But the Thunderbolt? It absorbed punishment like a tank in the sky. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine, once mocked for its bulk, was proving to be one of the most durable engines of the war. German fighters could pour bullets into it, and it would keep turning. The liquid-cooled engines of other planes often failed after a single puncture, but the Thunderbolt's air-cooled design meant fewer vulnerabilities. It didn't just fly, it endured. Slowly, pilots began to realize they weren't flying a failure. They were flying a giant, one that played by different rules. The key was learning how to use it. Traditional dogfighting, with tight turns and climbs, would never favor the Thunderbolt. But the P-47 had one hidden advantage no one could laugh at. It could dive faster than almost anything in the sky. German fighters that tried to chase a Thunderbolt downward often broke apart under the strain. The Jug, with its rugged airframe, simply held together. This tactic, swooping from above in a high-speed boom and zoom attack, turned the P-47 into a predator. Pilots no longer had to wrestle with tight turns. Instead, they struck like a hammer, delivered devastating fire, and then escaped before the enemy could react. Then came its firepower. Hidden inside those bulky wings were 850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, 4 on each side. When unleashed together, the Thunderbolt didn't just sting, it tore enemies apart. A single burst could rip through the fuselage of a Messerschmitt or slice a Focke-Wulf to pieces. German pilots who once sneered at the Jug's size began to fear the sheer wall of lead it could hurl across the sky. But perhaps the most important change was range. Engineers solved one of the P-47's biggest flaws by equipping it with drop tanks. These external fuel tanks extended its reach deep into enemy territory. Suddenly, the Thunderbolt could escort bombers farther than before. Missions that once forced the Jug to turn back too soon now saw them flying side by side with B-17s and B-24s, shielding them from German interceptors. And with each mission, the perception shifted. What was once mocked as clumsy began to be respected as deadly. Pilots who had complained about being assigned to the Jug now discovered a sense of security inside its cockpit. They knew that if they were hit, they stood a better chance of making it back alive in a Thunderbolt than in almost any other fighter. Survivability mattered just as much as maneuverability, and the P-47 delivered it in spades. The Luftwaffe too began to notice. Their early laughter gave way to unease. Encounters with P-47s grew bloodier. Where once they could count on outclimbing or outturning the enemy, now they faced a machine that wouldn't go down easily. And when it struck with overwhelming force. German pilots began to warn each other, don't underestimate the Jug. By late 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer just a disappointment. It was evolving into a terror of the skies. The very qualities that had been mocked, its weight, its bulk, its engine, were now proving to be its greatest strengths. It was a warplane built not for elegance, but for endurance and destruction. The transformation wasn't complete yet, but the foundation had been laid. The Thunderbolt had shown it wasn't just another fighter, it was a hidden giant. And soon that giant would unleash its true fury on the battlefields of Europe. By the late months of 1943, the Thunderbolt's reputation was shifting. It was no longer the laughingstock it had been when German and even Allied pilots dismissed it as too bulky and too slow. The aircraft's ruggedness, its punishing firepower, and its ability to dive like a stone had started to earn it respect. But respect alone was not enough. To truly matter in the war, the P-47 needed to prove it could dominate the skies over Europe. And for that, it had to change the way it was flown. The solution didn't come from redesigning the plane entirely, but from rethinking how to use it. Traditional dogfighting, turning in tight circles, climbing aggressively, and outmaneuvering opponents was not where the Thunderbolt excelled. But air combat was more than just spinning in circles. It was about using strengths to exploit weaknesses. And once pilots began flying the P-47 according to its strengths, everything changed. One of those strengths was altitude. With its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine and turbo supercharger, the Thunderbolt could perform far better at higher altitudes than many realized. Up where the air was thin, German fighters struggled to maintain performance. The Jug, however, could roar with power. Pilots learned to climb to the stratosphere before engaging, then dive at tremendous speeds onto unsuspecting enemies below. This tactic, known as boom and zoom, became the Thunderbolt's signature. The results were devastating. A P-47 swooping down from 25,000 feet could reach speeds German aircraft simply could not match. If the Luftwaffe tried to follow, their lighter planes risked tearing apart under the pressure of the dive. Meanwhile, the Jug remained stable, its airframe absorbing the punishment of gravity and speed without complaint. In this new style of combat, the very qualities once mocked its weight and bulk became its greatest weapons. Then came the question of range. At first, the P-47's limited fuel capacity prevented it from fully protecting Allied bombers on deep raids into Germany. American bombers often had to venture beyond the Thunderbolt's reach, only to be savaged by Luftwaffe interceptors. The solution was external drop tanks, simple detachable fuel tanks carried beneath the wings. With these tanks, the Thunderbolt suddenly gained legs long enough to escort bombers deeper into enemy skies. What was once a defensive limitation turned into a strategic strength. This breakthrough could not have come at a better time. The Allied bombing campaign against Germany was intensifying, with B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators striking factories, railways, and oil refineries. But those bombers needed protection. German fighters like the Bf-109 and Fw-190 had feasted on unescorted bomber formations, inflicting heavy losses. With drop tank-equipped P-47s, that feast was over. The Thunderbolts were there to meet the Luftwaffe head-on, shredding attackers with their 850 caliber machine guns, and it wasn't just the skies where the Jug found its role. As the Allies advanced across Europe, the P-47 discovered a second career: ground attack. Its massive frame allowed it to carry bombs and rockets, in addition to its already fearsome gun battery. Strafing German convoys, blasting rail lines and smashing armored columns became daily tasks. Soldiers on the ground began to love the sight of the Jug overhead, swooping down to hammer enemy positions. For them, the Thunderbolt was not clumsy. It was a guardian angel that struck terror into German troops. The Luftwaffe's view changed drastically as well. Where once they had laughed at the Jug, German pilots now respected and feared it. Reports filtered back of entire flights of Messerschmitts being torn apart by a single Thunderbolt's guns. Its survivability meant that even when hit, it often made it back home. For the Germans, this was frustrating. For the Allies, it was a confidence boost. Morale among American pilots began to rise. At first, many had dreaded being assigned to the Thunderbolt. They wanted Mustangs or Spitfires, planes with sleek lines and reputations for elegance in combat. But now those same pilots were beginning to see the Jug differently. They started calling it the Jug, not as an insult, but as a badge of affection. It wasn't pretty, but it was theirs, and it was keeping them alive. By 1944, the P-47 had gone from an underestimated oddity to a cornerstone of Allied air power. Its adaptability had unlocked a new dimension of warfare. The once mocked giant was now escorting bombers across the heart of Germany, slashing down Luftwaffe fighters and pounding targets on the ground with brutal efficiency. The turning point had arrived. The Thunderbolt was no longer just proving it could fight, it was proving it could win. And in war, that was all that mattered. But its story wasn't finished. Ahead lay its most feared identity, the airborne juggernaut that would unleash 8 roaring machine guns with a wall of lead so deadly that even hardened German aces would shudder at the sound. If the Thunderbolt's durability made it a survivor, its guns made it a killer. Nothing defined the P-47 more than the devastating roar of its .850 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. Mounted 4 in each wing, these weapons transformed the Jug from a clumsy heavyweight into one of the most terrifying predators of the skies. To understand the impact of those guns, imagine the scale. Most fighters of the era carried 4 or 6 machine guns, sometimes a pair of 20mm cannons. But the P-47 doubled down, 8 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute, unleashed a storm of lead that could chew through almost anything. In a 2-second burst, the Thunderbolt spat out more than 150 caliber rounds. Multiply that by 8 guns firing simultaneously, and the result was overwhelming firepower, unmatched by most aircraft of the war. German pilots, who had once laughed at the Jug's size, quickly learned that underestimating it could be fatal. A single head-on pass could leave a Messerschmitt Bf 109 or a Focke-Wulf 190 shredded beyond recognition. Even bombers with their armor and defensive turrets could be ripped apart by a concentrated barrage from a Thunderbolt. It wasn't finesse, it was raw destruction. But the 50s weren't just for air combat. On the ground, they were every bit as lethal. Thunderbolt pilots discovered the joy of strafing. Enemy convoys, trains, and troop formations stood no chance when the Jug swooped down and raked them with machine gun fire. Trucks erupted into flames, locomotives tore apart, and infantry scattered in panic as streams of armor-piercing rounds tore through steel and flesh alike. The sound of a Thunderbolt diving low, its guns thundering, became a nightmare for German soldiers. Survivors often described the experience as if the sky itself had opened up to rain bullets. The Jug's guns were also remarkably versatile. With different types of ammunition, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer, pilots could tailor their fire to any mission. Against aircraft, armor-piercing rounds cut through wings and engines. Against fuel depots or trucks, incendiary rounds turned targets into fireballs, and tracers glowing bright in the sky gave pilots both aim and psychological intimidation. Watching 8 fiery streams of bullets racing toward you was enough to make even seasoned Luftwaffe aces think twice. The sheer volume of fire also gave the Thunderbolt a unique tactical advantage. Pilots didn't have to be perfectly accurate to score hits. A short burst created a wide cone of destruction, increasing the chances of striking something vital. This made the Jug especially deadly in high-speed passes, where split-second firing decisions mattered. German fighters that tried to evade found themselves caught in the dense wall of lead, often shredded before they could escape. There were countless stories from the front lines that highlighted this firepower. Pilots recounted watching enemy aircraft disintegrate in mid-air, wings snapping off as if sliced by a giant blade. Ground crews collected photographs showing entire train cars ripped apart by strafing runs. In Normandy, during the weeks after D-Day, Thunderbolts obliterated German columns retreating through the French countryside. Villagers remembered the sight, huge American planes roaring low overhead, their guns hammering so fiercely that the earth shook. For the soldiers below, there was no escape. It was not elegance. It was not finesse. It was overwhelming force, and that force gave the Thunderbolt a psychological edge as much as a physical one. Luftwaffe pilots began to treat encounters with the P-47 more cautiously. They knew that one mistake, one poorly timed turn could end in an instant under the Jug's guns. German ground troops began to dread the sight of the aircraft's silhouette, wide wings, bulky fuselage, and the unmistakable roar of its engine, because they knew what usually followed. 8 streams of fire cutting everything in their path. American pilots, once skeptical of the Jug, grew to love it for those same reasons. They knew that when they pulled the trigger, they were unleashing one of the most powerful broadsides the air war had ever seen. Some pilots even joked that the Thunderbolt was less a fighter plane and more a flying gun platform. And in many ways, they were right. By the time 1944 rolled around, the 850s had cemented the Jug's reputation. No longer mocked as a lumbering giant, it was now recognized as a fearsome weapon of war. In the air, it could hold its own against German fighters. On the ground, it was a nightmare that tore apart supply lines and crushed enemy morale. The laughter that once followed the P-47 had been silenced, replaced by the thunder of its guns. The Jug had finally found its identity. It wasn't just durable. It wasn't just big. It was the flying hammer of the Allied air campaign, pounding the enemy with relentless, unmatchable firepower. And from that moment on, every time a P-47 took off, it carried with it the promise of devastation. The Jug was no longer the underdog. With its 850 caliber machine guns blazing, it had become one of the most feared fighters in the war. By the summer of 1943, the Thunderbolt was no longer the awkward rookie of the skies. It had grown into its role, and now it was time to prove itself in combat. What followed was a series of missions that would etch the P-47 into history as both a protector and a destroyer. The first major task assigned to the Jug was bomber escort duty. The U.S. Army Air Forces were sending waves of B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators deep into occupied Europe. These bombers packed heavy defensive firepower, but on their own they were vulnerable. German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, waited like hawks eager to slash into the bomber formations. At first, P-47s struggled with range. They couldn't follow the bombers all the way to Berlin, but in the zones where they could operate, they quickly earned a reputation as reliable escorts. When enemy fighters dove toward the bombers, the Jug's job was simple: intercept and destroy. Its speed in a dive and unmatched firepower made it perfect for quick, brutal engagements. Many Luftwaffe pilots learned the hard way that a Thunderbolt swooping in with its 850 caliber guns blazing was not something you could shrug off. Even if a German fighter managed to escape, it rarely came away without scars. But bomber escort was only half the story. The Jug soon revealed another side of its personality: ground attack. With its durability, the Thunderbolt could shrug off flak and small arms fire that might cripple a lighter plane. This gave pilots the confidence to dive low and strike enemy positions head-on. And when those 8 machine guns weren't enough, the Jug carried bombs and rockets to finish the job. On the ground, German soldiers learned to fear the P-47 as much as their pilots did in the air. Supply convoys, armored vehicles, and railway lines all became prime targets. The Jug's ability to destroy trains became legendary. Pilots would spot the telltale smoke of a locomotive, swoop down, and in a matter of seconds, the train was torn apart, cars derailed, engines burning, and ammunition exploding in a chain reaction. The Normandy campaign in 1944 showcased the Thunderbolt at its finest. As Allied troops stormed the beaches and pushed inland, the P-47 roared overhead, keeping pressure on German forces. Whenever the enemy tried to regroup or move reinforcements, Thunderbolts swooped in to smash them apart. Their presence gave ground troops confidence. They knew that above them was a weapon that could strike fear into any German formation. Pilots quickly developed tactics that played to the Jug's strengths. Dive, fire, climb, and repeat. It wasn't about dogfighting finesse. It was about delivering heavy blows and surviving to strike again. In the skies over France and Germany, Thunderbolts rained down destruction. often flying multiple missions a day. One of the most remarkable things about the P-47's combat record was its ability to take punishment and still return home. Countless stories circulated of Jugs limping back with holes in the fuselage, parts of wings missing, or entire cylinders shot out of their engines. Where other planes would have been lost, the Thunderbolt endured. For pilots, that reliability meant everything. They knew that even if the mission went badly, their Jug stood a good chance of bringing them home. By late 1944, the P-47 had become the backbone of Allied air power in Europe. It escorted bombers, smashed ground targets, and dominated the skies with its sheer presence. Its legend grew with every mission, and the once mocked fighter was now considered one of the most versatile and feared aircraft in the war. The Thunderbolt had gone from underdog to war hero, proving itself not just in statistics, but in the lived experiences of the men who flew it and the enemies who faced it. Behind every great warplane are the men who flew it, and the P-47 Thunderbolt was no exception. While its size, firepower, and toughness made it remarkable, it was the courage and skill of its pilots that transformed the Jug into a true legend of the skies. When the Thunderbolt first appeared, not every pilot was thrilled. Many wanted lighter, more agile fighters like the P-51 Mustang or the British Spitfire. The Jug seemed bulky and sluggish by comparison, but as combat experience grew, pilots discovered that the P-47's strengths weren't in flashy maneuvers. They were in power, durability, and devastating firepower. Once pilots embraced those strengths, the Jug became a beloved companion, earning a reputation for protecting its own and punishing the enemy. One of the most famous P-47 aces was Francis "Gabi" Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot who became the top U.S. fighter ace in Europe with 28 confirmed victories. Gabreski's aggressive tactics perfectly matched the Jug's abilities. He didn't rely on tight turns or acrobatics. Instead, he used diving speed and firepower to devastating effect. His favorite approach was the boom and zoom attack. Swoop in from above, unleash a furious burst, and climb back to safety before the enemy could react. Gabreski's confidence in his aircraft was unshakable. He once said, "If you wanted to live, you wanted to fly the P-47. Another legendary figure was Robert S. Johnson, one of the first Thunderbolt pilots to achieve ace status. Johnson's most famous encounter came in June 1943, when he was attacked by a German Focke-Wulf 190. His Jug was riddled with bullets, 190 hits in total, yet it refused to go down. The canopy was stuck shut, fuel was leaking, and Johnson himself was wounded, but the Thunderbolt kept flying. Even after the German pilot emptied his guns into the crippled Jug, Johnson's plane refused to die. He managed to nurse it back to base, proving once again that the P-47 was as indestructible as its legend claimed. Stories like Johnson's spread quickly, boosting the morale of American pilots and striking fear into the enemy. Then there was Hub Zemke, commander of the famed Zemke's Wolfpack, the 56th Fighter Group. Under his leadership, the Wolfpack became one of the most successful fighter groups in the entire U.S. Army Air Forces. Zemke understood the Jug's potential early and developed tactics that played to its strengths. His group excelled in bomber escort missions, often breaking up Luftwaffe attacks before they could reach the bombers. By the end of the war, the Wolfpack had destroyed over 1,000 enemy aircraft. Much of that credit owed to the P-47's sheer firepower and durability. But the Jug story wasn't only about famous names. Thousands of ordinary pilots forged extraordinary bonds with the aircraft. They praised its ability to absorb punishment, its reliability, and most importantly, its ability to bring them home alive. While other fighters demanded careful handling, the Thunderbolt was forgiving. It could dive at incredible speeds without falling apart, and its rugged airframe gave pilots the confidence to push limits. Many young aviators credited their survival to the Jug's strength rather than their own skill. For ground troops, the Jug's pilots were heroes too. Soldiers on the front lines often cheered when Thunderbolts appeared overhead, knowing that the big American fighters meant relief from enemy tanks, convoys, or artillery. Infantrymen told stories of Jugs swooping in low, ripping apart enemy formations with guns, bombs, and rockets, then disappearing back into the clouds. To the men on the ground, those pilots were guardian angels with wings of steel. Even German pilots, who once mocked the Jug as a lumbering beast, eventually learned to respect it. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland admitted that the P-47 was a difficult opponent, hard to kill, punishing to fight against, and lethal in a dive. Enemy soldiers on the ground gave the Jug nicknames of their own, describing it as a thunderous beast that rained destruction from the sky. One German prisoner reportedly told his interrogators, "We can handle the Spitfires and the Mustangs, but the Thunderbolt, when that one comes down on you, there is nothing you can do." That kind of grudging respect was perhaps the highest compliment an enemy could pay. By the end of the war, P-47 pilots had destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air and thousands more on the ground. Their contributions were immense, not only protecting bombers, but also crippling enemy logistics and giving Allied armies the air superiority they needed to win. The names of aces like Gabreski, Johnson and Zemke became part of aviation history, but behind them were countless others who flew, fought, and survived thanks to the Thunderbolt. The pilots of the Jug often described their relationship with the plane in personal terms. They didn't see it as just a machine, but as a partner, one that could take a beating and still carry them home. For many, it was the plane they trusted most, the one they believed gave them the best chance of survival. And survival mattered. In a war where so many young men never came back, the Thunderbolt's gift to its pilots was life itself. That, more than anything, explains why the Jug became legendary, not just because it destroyed enemies, but because it gave its own a fighting chance. The laughter that once followed the P-47 had been silenced by men who flew it into history. The Jug, heavy and unglamorous, had become a hero through the legends of those who trusted it with their lives. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the skies over Europe and the Pacific no longer thundered with the roar of the P-47, yet the mark it left on history remained unshakable. What began as a plane mocked for its size ended as one of the most feared and respected aircraft of the Second World War. The Thunderbolt's legacy was not simply written in numbers. It was etched into the memory of the pilots who flew it, the soldiers it protected, and even the enemies who learned to fear it. By the end of the war, the Thunderbolt had compiled an astonishing record. P-47 pilots destroyed more than 7,000 enemy aircraft in the air, thousands more on the ground, and wreaked havoc on German supply lines. They flew more than 500,000 sorties, delivering bombs, rockets, and untold millions of rounds of machine gun fire. Perhaps most impressive, the Jug's combat loss rate was lower than many other fighters, thanks to its legendary toughness. For every enemy it destroyed, it saved a pilot's life by bringing him home against impossible odds. What set the P-47 apart was its versatility. It wasn't the sleekest dogfighter. That crown often went to the P-51 Mustang, but it was unmatched in its ability to switch roles. Escort fighter, bomber destroyer, tank buster, train hunter. The Jug did it all. In Europe, it was the hammer that smashed German logistics. In the Pacific, it provided vital ground support against entrenched Japanese positions. Its adaptability made it indispensable, and that adaptability foreshadowed the kind of multi-role fighters that would dominate air forces in the decades to come. For Allied ground troops, the sight of the P-47 overhead was more than just reassurance. It was a symbol of survival. Infantrymen advancing through France, Belgium, and Germany often spoke about how the Thunderbolt owned the battlefield from above. Its ability to unleash destruction on enemy columns saved countless lives on the ground. That bond between soldier and aircraft gave the Jug a reputation not only as a killer, but as a protector. Even the Luftwaffe, once dismissive, could not ignore the Jug's impact. German pilots learned to fear its dive speed and firepower, while German troops came to dread its strafing runs. That respect, grudging though it was, speaks volumes. The P-47 had gone from being the butt of jokes to being recognized as a machine of war that demanded caution from even the most experienced enemy. With peace restored, the Jug's frontline career gradually ended. New jet fighters like the P-80 Shooting Star and F-86 Sabre were the future, and the age of prop-driven warbirds was closing. Yet the P-47 was not forgotten. Many nations continued to fly it into the late 1940s and even the 1950s. In Latin America, some Thunderbolts remained in service for years. Museums, airshows, and restorations have since kept the Jug alive, reminding new generations of the role it played in securing victory. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the P-47 is the way it reshaped the definition of a fighter. It proved that an aircraft didn't have to be elegant to be effective. It showed that survival, endurance, and versatility could win wars just as much as speed or maneuverability. And above all, it became a symbol of the American approach to air power: overwhelming force, rugged engineering, and a refusal to back down. For the pilots who flew it, the Jug was more than an airplane. It was a lifeline, a weapon, and a partner in survival. For the soldiers on the ground, it was a savior. And for the enemy, it was the relentless hammer that never stopped falling. The German pilots may have laughed when they first saw the Thunderbolt, but by the war's end, nobody was laughing. The Jug had thundered into history, leaving behind a legacy of strength, survival, and victory that still echoes in the skies today.